The wind carried a chill that autumn morning in 1914, but it was not the cold that settled over the trading floor in London. It was the sudden silence, brokers lingering in doorways, clerks staring at telegraph machines that had stopped blinking, the world's great financial machine grinding to a halt with no clear human hand to pull the lever. Across Europe, stock exchanges flickered off one by one. Within days, credit lines that had fueled decades of booming trade evaporated. Ships waited in harbors loaded with goods no one could pay for. The system had not been bombed, invaded, or legislated into oblivion. It had simply stopped working, not because leaders willed it, but because the architecture of trust beneath it had cracked. This pattern is older than 1914, and it predates even the most storied empires of the last millennium. In the late Han Dynasty, markets once vibrant with Silk Road trade fell eerily silent as credit evaporated and provincial treasuries went empty. In Renaissance Italy, the great banks of Florence and Siena collapsed under the weight of overextended loans, leaving monarchs and merchants stranded without the instruments that had long powered commerce. The record of history is not evenly marked by wars and conquests, but by invisible breakdowns in the networks that allow societies to exchange value. These moments are not characterized by dramatic explosions or sudden declarations. They begin with a subtle shift in confidence, a hesitation in markets that should hum with activity. Spreads widen, counterparties delay settlements, and the engines of credit that underwrite everyday exchange whisper instead of roar. Trade contracts that once settled with cursory trust now require scrutiny. Bills of exchange, letters of credit, promissory notes, the very tools that make trade fluid, become objects of suspicion. Without trust in these instruments, trade contracts cannot be honored, and the chain that binds one economy to another starts to unravel. In 1914, the collapse of confidence did not happen overnight, but when it did, the result was immutable. Cross-border trade without the mediation of reliable financial settlement ceased. Currencies were hoarded, gold flowed inward, and the global economy contracted. National treasuries, unprepared for a sudden demand for liquidity, resorted to measures that made matters worse. The world slid into a downturn that would not truly mend for years. Today, another pattern unfolds in front of our eyes, though its mechanisms are not yet fully acknowledged. Instruments of settlement, once taken for granted, are being reshaped outside the frameworks that have governed them since the end of World War II. For the first time in decades, nations are quietly settling trade without the traditional intermediation of banks, not because technology has made it simple, but because the underlying incentives of finance are shifting under global pressure. In the vaults of old systems, the gears are still turning. But somewhere deep in the machinery, the key cog, trust and intermediation, is slipping. And once that cog falters, the machine does not sputter and restart. It stops. The silence comes first. Then the question of what comes next. The collapse most often described in history is not an abrupt implosion, like a fortress wall blown open by cannon fire. It is an internal decay. A failure of structure and logic so gradual that those within the system mistake weakness for strength until the moment of rupture. What we call collapse in hindsight is typically the visible end of a process that began years, sometimes decades earlier, in the realm of economics and finance, long before politics or armies take the stage. In its earliest phase, the system functions normally. Trade flows, credit expands, investment rises, and confidence, though often unexamined, undergirds daily activity. The instruments that facilitate exchange, bank credit, sovereign debt, currency arrangements, operate invisibly. Their resilience is assumed rather than tested. Yet it is within this assumption that the seed of instability takes root. Gradually, pressures build. Stage 1 begins with distortion. Monetary expansion outpaces productivity. Debt grows faster than output. Prices and asset valuations rise beyond historical norms. The excess is rationalized as innovation or structural transformation. Stage 2 is overextension. Credit spreads widen, not yet to alarm, but enough to signal that risk is accumulating in opaque corners of the system. Borrowers who once stood on reliable foundations now rely on future growth to service obligations they can barely meet today. By stage 3, confidence, that invisible lubricant of markets, begins to thin. Counterparties demand larger cushions, tighter terms, longer settlement periods. Instruments that once circulated freely start to bear marks of caution. In normal times, banks and financial intermediaries absorb risk. In this stage, they hoard liquidity, shrinking the pool of credit available. The cost of capital rises even as economic actors pretend stability persists. Stage 4 arrives as systemic friction. Markets creak under the weight of deferred payments and unresolved claims. Trade, always underwritten by trust in instruments that promise future settlement, begins to falter. Letters of credit that moved goods half a world away become contested. Payments are delayed, renegotiated, or defaulted. The illusion of seamless exchange starts to flicker. If unchecked, stage 5 unfolds into crisis, a cessation of normal settlement processes. Banks retrench, sovereigns intervene, and emergency measures attempt to patch fractures. But in the absence of confidence, patchwork solutions often create moral hazard, a stage 6 where denial deepens. Leaders and institutions proclaim resilience while the foundational mechanics erode. Finally, stage 7 is the irreversible break. Credit instruments lose their power to guarantee transaction fulfillment. Markets descend into barter-like arrangements, not by choice, but by necessity. The system reverts to primitive forms of exchange because the intermediaries and agreements that once bestowed trust no longer command faith. This 7-stage pattern, repeated in various forms across empires and economies, is not a sensational arc. It is quiet, incremental, and seldom noticed until the final stages are well underway. In its early phases, the system feels stable; in its middle, resilient. Only at the end does the full weight of unraveling become visible. And by then, the outcome feels inevitable. In the late 4th century, the Roman Empire was a colossus that stretched from the windswept frontiers of Britannia to the sun-baked deserts of Egypt. Its roads, aqueducts, and ports enabled commerce on a scale unmatched in the ancient world. The currency of Rome, once a reliable medium of exchange, flowed through cities and provinces like blood through veins. Wealth was immense, and yet its circulation was fragile. The empire's rise was built on the integration of far-flung territories, the extraction of tribute, and the disciplined functioning of bureaucracies that ensured taxes, grain, and coin reached their intended destinations. But structural stress was embedded within the system. Military expansion required resources, which were increasingly financed by stretching the state's credit. Coinage was debased to meet obligations, creating a subtle but persistent distortion in the value of money. Debt, both public and private, accumulated as the state sought to sustain its dominance. Provincial administrators and military commanders were incentivized to consume rather than produce, spending more than they generated locally, confident that Rome's central authority would supply the difference. Productivity began to lag as local economies shrank beneath the weight of extraction. By the late 3rd century, cracks were apparent. Inflation eroded the purchasing power of ordinary citizens. Merchants and artisans found it increasingly difficult to settle debts with currency that lost value almost daily. The once seamless flow of trade slowed as confidence in coinage faltered. Taxes went unpaid or were partially substituted with goods, forcing the state to accept complex settlements that strained administrative capacity. Social tensions emerged. The gap between the elite, who could navigate the collapsing system, and the common populace, who could not, widened dramatically. Wealth flowed upward to the empire's centers of power, but it rarely remained in the provinces where production occurred. Local economies stagnated even as Rome appeared lavish and triumphant. Urban centers, which had thrived on commerce, began to crumble. Markets became unreliable. When external pressures, invasions, plagues, and political instability finally collided with the already weakened economic structure, the empire could no longer sustain itself. Regions that had once been integrated through trade and law slipped into localized barter, forced to meet their needs without the machinery that had once bound them together. Rome's decline illustrates the inevitability of systemic failure when incentives favor extraction over renewal, when currency loses reliability, and when debt compounds without productive backing. The empire did not fall in a single dramatic act. It unraveled over decades, quietly, invisibly, in the marketplaces, accounting ledgers, and roads that connected its vast territories. By the time historians recount battles and sacking, the economic underpinnings had already long ceased to function. The system failed not because of some singular catastrophe, but because the structures that had sustained it were stretched past the point of repair, and the mechanisms that once facilitated trust no longer held. 3 centuries later, in the 18th century, another illusion of permanence gripped Europe. The Dutch Republic, a hub of global trade and finance, had pioneered the modern banking system, creating instruments that allowed merchants to transact across oceans with minimal physical transfer of gold. Confidence in these instruments was absolute, until it was not. Investors were convinced that the prosperity of the Republic, built on commerce, shipping, and finance, could never falter. "This time is different," they whispered, as they leveraged their positions, stretching credit beyond the bounds of historical precedent. In reality, the same stages of collapse that had imperceptibly weakened Rome were already unfolding. Speculative investments swelled while productive capacity failed to keep pace. Wealth concentrated among financiers and merchants, but the broader population saw diminishing returns from trade as wages stagnated and essential goods became increasingly expensive. Denial masked the systemic fragility. Officials and investors alike assumed liquidity would always be available, that trade would continue to flow, that instruments of settlement, the very letters of credit and bills of exchange that had once inspired confidence, could not fail. But subtle signals of distress were present. Interest spreads widened, settlements were delayed, and some firms quietly defaulted on obligations. Warning signs were rationalized: temporary mismanagement, seasonal downturns, or foreign interference. The narrative of stability persisted even as the underlying mechanics deteriorated. Credit expansion continued, feeding speculation rather than production. The economy became a house of paper, brilliantly constructed but precariously balanced. When the inevitable tipping point arrived, the Republic's financial system did not crash with the fury of a sudden explosion. It simply stopped functioning as it had. Banks refused to honor letters of credit, trade contracted sharply, and merchants scrambled to meet obligations with what liquidity remained. Those who had assumed permanence faced ruin, while the common population bore the social consequences: unemployment, scarcity, and rising unrest. The very instruments that had enabled trade across continents were rendered meaningless in the face of systemic failure. This pattern, repeated across centuries, demonstrates that collapse is rarely the result of malice or incompetence alone. It is born from structural incentives, from the slow accumulation of distortions, overextension, and the erosion of trust. Each era's confident assertion that this time is different only delayed recognition of what history had already revealed. The stages of collapse, subtle and inexorable, repeat themselves even under new conditions, and the outcome remains remarkably consistent. In the decades following World War II, the global economic order was rebuilt on an architecture designed to prevent the kinds of breakdowns that had brought the world to war and depression. The Bretton Woods system, the IMF, the World Bank, and a dense network of correspondent banking relationships underwrote a world in which trade settlement was mediated by trusted financial institutions. Banks were not just intermediaries of capital. They were custodians of confidence. They provided the infrastructure, legal, operational, technical, that allowed one trader in Southeast Asia to deliver goods to Europe and receive payment days later, without either party ever touching gold or cash. This system endured because the underlying incentives supported it. Banks profited from settlement and trade finance. Governments acquiesced because stability facilitated growth, and firms adapted their supply chains around reliable intermediation. The network effect was powerful. Once trade and finance were interwoven with banking settlement, alternative arrangements were marginal, experimental, or peripheral. In the early 21st century, stresses began to accumulate in this edifice. Debt levels in advanced economies rose to historic highs relative to GDP. Central banks responded to crises with unconventional monetary policies that compressed returns and encouraged risk-taking. Cross-border regulatory complexity increased, making compliance expensive and slowing payments. Most critically for settlement systems, trust began to erode, not because banks suddenly became untrustworthy in an ethical sense, but because the incentives that once guaranteed liquidity and reliability were weakening. At the same time, geopolitical tensions heightened. Nations with large trade imbalances and strategic resources began to question whether reliance on the traditional banking system served their interests. In bilateral trade relationships with friends and rivals alike, some governments quietly experimented with direct settlement mechanisms, clearing arrangements that bypass banks, using national currencies, or leveraging alternative messaging networks that could move value outside the established correspondent banking channels. These systems, once fringe, grew in relevance as the costs and frictions of traditional banking settlement mounted. Corporations that once depended on letters of credit found themselves exploring direct payment systems. Sovereign wealth funds began structuring contracts that settled in instruments outside the dominant financial intermediaries. The narrative within financial circles shifted. Settlement was no longer the exclusive domain of banks with entrenched infrastructure. It was a competitive space where efficiency and control mattered more than tradition. This is not a partisan argument or a prediction. It is an observation of structure. When the incentives that sustain one class of intermediary weaken, alternatives emerge not because they are ideologically preferred, but because economic actors respond to cost, risk, and opportunity. Trust in a system, whether embodied in a bank or encoded in software, is not immutable. It is contingent on performance and incentives, and history shows that when settlement trust frays, trade relationships adapt, often in ways that fundamentally reshape the networks that underpin global exchange. Late-stage systems often appear calm, even confident, precisely because the mechanisms of denial and normalization are strongest at the end. Institutions and market participants develop elaborate narratives to explain away anomalies, framing frictions as temporary, technical, or idiosyncratic. Central banks reassure, governments assert stability, and analysts highlight growth metrics that obscure the deeper structural stresses. The public sees normalcy. Insiders know the system is stretched, yet act as though risk can be indefinitely postponed. This phase of acceleration is deceptive. Risk becomes routine. Credit that would once have been considered unsafe is treated as acceptable. Settlement frictions, liquidity shortfalls, and counterparty exposures are reframed as manageable. History teaches that this is the moment when collapse feels most distant, and it is precisely when the system is closest to rapid deterioration. Those who issue warnings are dismissed as alarmists because the prevailing narrative is one of confidence and resilience. Institutional denial is reinforced by incentive structures. Banks, regulators, and corporations have reputations, revenue streams, and strategic plans tied to the appearance of stability. Acknowledging systemic fragility could trigger panic, undermine confidence, and incur personal or organizational costs. So warnings are minimized, delayed, or reframed. Similarly, societies normalize risk. Consumers, investors, and states accept what would once have been intolerable exposures because the immediate consequences appear minor or manageable. Each successive day of apparent normalcy reinforces the belief that the system is sound. And yet, this apparent stability is a mirage. Small perturbations, ignored or rationalized during the acceleration phase, compound unseen. Settlement mechanisms are strained, margins compressed, and liquidity hoarded. The very friction that once seemed negligible becomes the catalyst for rapid, non-linear deterioration. When the tipping point arrives, it is abrupt in experience, if not in cause. The system's outer calm masks the inner fragility, and by the time failure is recognized, the capacity to act effectively has already passed. The acceleration phase illustrates the paradox of late-stage systems. The closer they are to breakdown, the more stable they seem. And in that deceptive calm, participants misinterpret timing for safety, continuity for resilience, and control for mastery, a misreading that history has repeated across centuries, from ancient empires to modern economies. History repeats not because humans fail to learn, but because incentives endure. Systems rise, expand, and concentrate wealth because doing so rewards effort, ingenuity, and influence. Over time, the very mechanisms that create prosperity, credit, trust, exchange networks, accumulate stresses that become invisible to those within them. Productivity falters, debts swell, and confidence is taken for granted until the system reaches a point where trust cannot be restored without fundamental restructuring. Cycles are neither moral nor accidental. They are structural. They arise from patterns of behavior embedded in institutions, markets, and governments. When incentives reward consumption over production, speculation over stability, or short-term gain over long-term viability, collapse is simply the arithmetic of human systems expressing itself. Across eras, the details change: Roman roads and coinage, Dutch letters of credit, modern banking networks. But the underlying dynamics remain remarkably consistent. Recognizing these forces is not an exercise in fear. It is an invitation to study, to observe, and to understand. The very same structures that facilitate trade and wealth also embed fragility. Confidence, once lost, is difficult to restore. Instruments that once enabled fluid commerce can become barriers. Nations and corporations adjust to these realities, often experimenting with mechanisms that bypass traditional intermediaries, seeking efficiency, sovereignty, or security. These adjustments signal that the system is alive, adaptive, but also that it remains subject to the immutable laws of trust and incentive. If you're watching for the first time, welcome to the Economy Club. This is where we study the forces that shape history and the patterns that quietly decide the future. Stay curious, stay grounded, and we'll see you in the next cycle.